Okay guys, I'm going to quickly go over these notes with you. As you are watching me go over the notes, you are welcome to be working in your boss and answering the questions that go along with the boss. Any questions that you miss, you'll have these notes and this video to go back to and refer to get the last few questions that you might have. This unit is about cells and how we classify cells. And so the title of these notes are prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. We're going to learn about cells and the different kinds of cells there are today. Okay, so today's learning targets are two things, okay? You are going to hopefully be able to describe the difference between unicellular and multicellular organisms today, and also be able to identify the differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. There are some really important keywords that you need to pay attention to today. So we've got the word cell, abiotic, biotic, prokaryote, eukaryote, unicellular, and multicellular. So we're looking at cells are biotic things. So you guys have probably learned in 5th grade that biotic is associated with living things and abiotic is associated with non-living things. Prokaryotes and eukaryotes are just different kinds of cells, and unicellular and multicellular are ways to describe how many cells an organism has. So, we're looking at things that you kind of learn about in elementary school. You, again, probably learned these words, abiotic and biotic, and you probably associated biotic with living things. And these are some things you need to know about all living things. All living things are biotic. All living things reproduce. They need energy. They grow and develop, and they're made of cells. Okay. Abiotic things do not meet any of those criteria. And so it's really important for you to understand for 6th grade that biotic includes this idea of things that are living, but also things that used to be living. Okay. Abiotic is referring to not alive, never was. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in our next unit, but that is something that you kind of need to think of. And what we're looking at today is this idea of this basic building block of living things, which is a cell. So what is a cell? It's the smallest unit of life, and cells can be unicellular organisms, so it can be a living thing can just be made of one cell, or a living thing can be made of trillions of cells, like us. And so here you can see these are 4 different organisms. So a paramecium, an amoeba, and a bacteria, and a yeast. These are all different kinds of organisms. They don't even belong to the same biological kingdoms. But then we have this one human who has trillions of cells, and not only do they have trillions of cells, but they have different kinds of cells. We have different kinds of cells in our bodies. All right, so these are some examples of cells. I've got 4 pictures here. So this is an amoeba cell. It's a unicellular organism. This is a group of plant cells from a leaf. Here we have some red blood cells and white blood cells moving through the blood vessels in a human, and this is a human nerve cell or a neuron. Okay, so these are all some different kinds of cells. The cell theory is the basic science rule about cells, and it has 3 parts to it, and they all kind of sound like they're repeating. So I've talked about how they're a little bit different each step. So all living things are made of cells. So basically what that means is you must have at least one cell to be a living thing. Okay. Anything, number 2 is cells are the smallest units of life. So if you have one cell, you can be alive, but the parts that make up a cell, so these little organisms, these protists are here, these are 2 cells or 2 different living things. But the things inside of them, if I just took one of these things out, it by itself wouldn't be alive because it's not enough to make one cell. It's just part of one cell. Okay, so all living things, all of the things in this picture are made of cells, one or more cells, and a cell is the smallest thing you can have and still be considered to be living. And cells come from pre-existing cells, so they don't just appear out of nowhere. Cells reproduce and make new cells of the same kind. So pretty easy. All living things are made of cells. Cells are the smallest unit of life, and cells come from other cells. All right, so again, we're looking at this vocabulary of unicellular versus multicellular. Uni means one. Cellular means to have cells, right? So unicellular is one cell. Almost all cells are microscopic. They're very hard to see with the naked eye, whether it's a really big unicellular creature or one of your cells or a really small unicellular creature. So here you can see in this picture there is an amoeba, and then down on the bottom there are two other small cells. We have a little rod-shaped and a circle-shaped cell, and they are not even the size of some of the little dots inside of this amoeba cell. So there's a wide variety in cell size for unicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms mean many, and they also, when you have many different cells, you typically have many different kinds of cells. So your body can do more things, right? So you probably know that you have muscle cells, and that you have fat cells, and that you have lung cells, and so you have all this specialization. The more cells you have, then the more complex an organism can be. All right, so here's some examples of some unicellular organisms, and here's some examples of some multicellular organisms. Pretty easy to tell the difference. It either looks kind of like a roundish, squiggly-ish looking single cell, or it looks like a creature. All right. So there are two main types of cells, and those main types of cells are called prokaryotic or eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotes can be divided into two categories, and eukaryotes can be divided into 4 categories. The categories are a little bit different. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so similarities between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. If you look at this, maybe you can take a second or two to see if you can tell anything that these two cells have in common. What are some commonalities? Okay, so here are some commonalities. When we looked at those energy, they're living things, right? So we know that they need energy and that they reproduce. That's part of the cell theory and part of the characteristics of living things. All cells also have DNA. They have a structure called a cell membrane, so they have an outer layer. Okay. They have a structure called ribosomes, and they make proteins, and they have stuff that fills like a fluid that fills the inside of a cell, and that's called cytoplasm. So here you can tell the cell membrane is the outermost layer of this cell, this eukaryotic cell, and it's the second outermost layer of this prokaryotic cell. Cell membranes determine what go in and out of the cell. Okay, ribosomes make proteins. Cytoplasm just helps things to happen in the cell, kind of like water helps things to happen in your body. Okay, so the main difference, and I'm sure you probably noticed that there's the size difference. Okay, and that's kind of related to the main difference, but what we're looking at here is the presence of a nucleus. So eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Here's this big nucleus. You can also see that there's other bigger organelles. They're called membrane-bound organelles. The whole cell is membrane-bound. It has a cellular membrane. But these larger organelles have their own little layer around them that has a membrane as well. So the main organelle is that nucleus with the membrane around it. So eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. So that's what you do as a way to help you to remember that. You do have a nucleus, and you, as a human, are a eukaryote. Prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. They're very, very tiny. They don't really have a lot of room. So the DNA that you see inside this nucleus here is just kind of floating around inside the cytoplasm of this cell. So pro is prokaryotes,